Alright, welcome back to another devlog. Technically it's been a few months since the last one. I've been a bit busy doing some stuff like the trailer, Steam page. I also moved, started a new job. But now we're back and we're doing some actual game progress. Today I'm gonna kind of be continuing where the last devlog was and talk about how I added world state to the GOP system. So first, let's give a little recap. I'm working on a game where you return to an abandoned game project, only to find that the NPCs have taken it upon themselves to keep the game alive and evolving while you were gone. And the key to this dynamic game world is a sophisticated NPC system that I'm designing to basically have the NPCs mimic real, personalities and decision making. I've been doing this using something called GOP, goal-oriented action programming. You might be asking why invest so much time and effort into creating such complex NPC behavior. With the game, I want to combine gameplay from games like Stardew Valley, Animal Crossing with one critical addition: NPCs that genuinely impact the game. So unlike the somewhat static characters you might find, especially in the latest Animal Crossing, I want my NPCs to offer dynamic reactions and interactions to the game world that will enrich and impact the player's experience. So imagine causing a little bit of chaos and then watching the NPCs respond with frustration or surprise. If you haven't watched my last devlog, I suggest doing that first for an in-depth explanation of the GOP system, but if you don't feel like it, here's a little explanation or just a little recap. The GOP system, or goal-oriented action programming system, allows the NPCs to assess their environment and decide the best actions to achieve their objectives or goals. And these goals are chosen based on their unique needs or desire. Basically, once an NPC picks a goal, they try to find the best sequence of actions based on the state of things in the game in order to achieve that goal. Then they try to do it and hopefully it works out. So the concept of world state plays a pivotal role in this system, and I only briefly touched upon how I was going to be setting this up in the GOP video. So now I want to dive in depth into exactly how I am tracking the status of all of these things. So world state is all about understanding the condition of objects in the game world. For instance, a chair state might be occupied or available. This is critical information for an NPC who might have an action where they decide if they're gonna sit down somewhere or not. Because the NPCs need to know the status of objects around them to make informed decisions. So keeping track of world state is a little complicated. Why do we even need it? Well, we need it because the NPCs are dumb. That's right, I said it. Okay. They're not necessarily dumb, it's more the fact that the NPCs aren't aware of what's going on in the game unless I tell them. Despite my best efforts, they are not actually sentient, they are not actually capable of learning. That is a whole nother type of project. So they're only capable of making those complex decisions if they're fully aware of their surroundings. So that means I need a system to keep track of everything in the game that's happening when it happens. So this includes not only things that the player is changing the state of, but also that the other NPCs themselves are changing the state of. When designing the NPC system, I often reflect on how we humans interact with the world and make decisions based on our surroundings. So obviously, the human brain is way more complicated than my NPC's brain, but translating some of that decision-making process into data can make the NPC behavior feel a lot more realistic. The system is actually divided into two parts: world state and self state. World state refers to the game world's condition, while self state is all about the NPC's personal status, where they are, what they're doing, how much money they have, etc. All things I ask myself daily. This distinction is key because some of the actions have preconditions requiring the NPCs to evaluate their own status. So if they are hungry, they should probably first evaluate if they have any food in their inventory and eat that first before they decide to go on an entire journey of trying to find food somewhere. A lot of the self-state was actually set up with the GOP system originally when I made the entire system basically that helps the NPCs decide what goal they want to do next. So now I need some way to keep track of world state, the changes to objects in my game. So here's an overview of what the map looks like in my game from a bird's eye view. It's just a big rock floating in space. I decided to confine most of my game activities to this main map, all within one Unity scene. Yes, I am aware of the potential performance nightmares, but that's a problem for future me to tackle. All of the actions that the NPCs are going to be able to perform will be confined to this map. And from there, I broke the world state down further into two parts, buildings and grid squares. Grid squares referring to basically this entire grid that the NPCs currently are using for the pathfinding. I'm going to talk a lot more about grid squares in the next video actually, because I haven't fully finished setting up the system yet, and also the video will just be too long. So grid squares will be in part 2, but for this video I want to specifically focus on the buildings. And the reason that the buildings are separate from the rest of the game is because they have to work a little bit differently. I mentioned before that I set up A-star pathfinding for the NPCs, and it works great for trying to get them from one place to another to do things like pick up resources. But for buildings it's actually a big problem. You see, I have these nice buildings, and the interiors of these buildings are way over here, floating in space. When the NPC wants to get into a building, they can't just walk through the abyss to get there. And this ends up adding a few extra steps to the GOP system. People can generally look at a building and figure out its functionality and purpose, but the NPCs don't have eyes. They need to decipher information based on code. So how can I translate the understanding that humans have of buildings function into code that the NPCs comprehend? I did this basically by breaking buildings down into two types of data, static and dynamic. So static data being the unchanging characteristics of the building. I simplified the static data management a lot and basically made it so I could just assign where the building entrances and exits were, or relevant game objects within the building that aren't going to be moving around. That way the NPC can always reliably access this information. Meanwhile, the dynamic data involves things that will be changing in the game world as the game is played. So things like resource contributions to the buildings or inventory available in shops. This makes sure that the NPCs in play are engaging with the same dynamic data. So now basically I have a way for the buildings to keep track of their data themselves. Now we need a place for all of the building data to live so the NPCs can find the information they need. And this is done with the building manager. I have a centralized place where all of the data for the building lives. So how are we actually going to use this data? The GOP system planning actually works backwards. So the NPCs need to know, hey, I'm trying to do this thing, and that thing is probably in a building. Okay, well, like, which building is it in? And they can look at the building manager script to find that information. Okay, so now the NPC has figured out what building their thing is in, but they're outside. They need to find the door. Easy, no. The NPCs are able to basically have an internal checklist where they can confirm that everything is in order before they decide to go into the building. So they're already inside the building, they don't try to leave and come back in immediately. They also verify buildings still exist. Can I even get in the doors? Or special cases like if somebody else owns the building and maybe they're not supposed to go there. So now I can get to the door. Like I mentioned, the insides of the buildings are way over here. So now I need to basically simulate the NPCs going inside. For the player, when they try to go into a building, they walk through a trigger that teleports them to this game object over here. For the NPCs, I'm actually doing something pretty similar. They just don't walk through the trigger. Instead, they just get teleported directly to the spots that they need to be in the building. And then from there, the action of entering the building is completed. Once inside, the NPCs are able to navigate the building's interior, interacting with objects and resources. Once again, the building dynamic data is what's tracking the changing things inside of the building. So things like resource levels, especially because the player and the NPCs can interact with the same shops in the game. I also have an interactable class, which was originally designed for player interactions, but I extended it to also work for the NPCs as well. So two small little things that I worked on as well was, one, I have this restaurant, which I drew the sprite for this before I kind of fully set up the GOP system and thought all of this out. So when I drew this, I made it so the building is 2 floors, and this really screwed me over because now the NPCs have to navigate between the 2 floors. But the fix actually wasn't that bad for this. It basically functions a similar way to how entering and exiting the buildings does. I'm just teleporting them between the floors, and I just have to make sure that they know which things in the building are on what floor, but that only really applies to this building. I didn't draw any of the other buildings to have 2 floors. I did also want to mention the fact that I did work on giving the NPCs jobs. So right now, the way this works actually is in a bit of a capitalist dystopian nightmare. The building actually has workers assigned to it, and it calls them in when it's time for them to go to work. Basically, once it starts to get close to the time that the NPC needs to go to work, the building starts checking where they are and how far away they are, and then it calls out to them and says, hey, you should probably get your butt over here because you're going to be late. And then the NPC will actually make work their first priority and stop whatever they're doing, and then just like head over to the building. Ultimately, setting everything up like this allows me to add new actions to the GOP system easily. Since all of the buildings handle data the same way, it's easy for me to add in new buildings to the game as I add more content. It's also easy for me to create complex actions that might rely on all of this data in the game. In essence, I'm crafting a world where the NPCs don't just exist, they live. They make decisions based on the environment, their needs, what's happening around them. They contribute to building upgrades, they shop, they work, and yes, they even get in the way sometimes. But that's all part of the charm of the game. So integrating the world state into the game's AI is more than just a technical thing. It's a step towards me creating a game world where the NPCs actually matter. A world where their decisions, personalities, and interactions affect the player's journey in the game. That's it for this Devlog though. Part 2 is the grid.